divinity is soul. I always start off with seeds because when you read seed catalogs and you look at all the glorious pictures, you have the idea that you simply have to put the little seed in the soil, and without tender loving care or anything subsequent, the thing is going to grow and produce what the picture shows. And this is how I sort of got the idea for the soil makes the garden. Could we have the lights now, please? And so, some people like to do their things with art, and other people like to do their things with seeds, as Edgar Guest wrote. But regardless of what you plant, you'll not achieve the beauty of the flowers, the taste of the dill, the diversity of produce that's so exciting for fun and nutrition. You won't be able to grow these prize leeks. You won't be able to have nice potatoes like those Kennebecks. And hopefully you'll be able to grow tomatoes that will compare with your neighbors who doesn't know all of the things that you do. And maybe you'll produce the best berries in town as well. You see, when we're talking about gardening, we're not just talking about fun and not just talking about vegetables, but we're really talking about something that basically starts with soil. And so this whole talk deals with garden soil. And looking at soil from a soil point of view, or perhaps from a worm's point of view, or a root's point of view. Because gardeners, even though we talk about doing things with soil, know very little about soil, we never take the trouble to dig. How many of you have ever dug a 3-foot hole in your garden so you can see what's down below? I dare say that few gardeners have ever done that. Hey, we've got 2 real gardeners. Oh, 3 gardeners in the group. And all the time we should be considering that as we grow vegetables, we're not only concerned with what we see, but we're also concerned with what's in them. That all of these things over here, which we call foods, are not just foods that are grown for us through the action of vegetable growing, but these are also foods for the vegetable itself. And in fact, we're all a bunch of thieves because we're completely dependent upon the things that are in the vegetable. The proteins, the starches, the fats, the oils, the hormones, the sugars, the vitamins. We're all put there for the purpose of recreating another vegetable, the next generation. And somehow we believe they're for us, and so we steal them from the garden. And what we steal and how we grow it and the kind of soil it's grown in obviously affects the health of we who eat them and the friends that we give them to. And so regardless of whether we're talking about baby plants just starting out or those that have been started, that happens to be my wife if you've never seen her. She does part of my work. There's nothing better for a successful garden than having an ambitious wife, I'll tell you, and particularly when it comes to weeding. But this is the result. And all of these things, while seeds are important, in the dairy business they used to say that the breeding of the cow was 20% of success, and the feeding of the cow was 80% of success. I believe this is true with vegetables too, that it is important to pick the right variety and disease resistance. But in the end, I do believe that the soil makes the garden. And if you don't understand the soil and you don't do the soil right, then choosing the seeds is all for naught. And so when you plant these things properly, with tender loving care, you'll have a hand in producing something as beautiful as those, and tasty too. Now my function this morning is to try to get you interested about soil. Isn't it great? Huh? There's nothing mechanical, it doesn't blink, it's not electronic, it doesn't use electricity, it doesn't require a license. You know, there's none of the usual things that entertain people. I suppose there is such a thing as the politics of soil, although I don't know that I could explain it to you. But the soil is probably the most complex thing on earth. For it includes everything that lived, everything that died, everything that decomposed, all of the things that are living now, both above and below the ground, and all of the chemistry that you can't see, all of the gases that are in the soil, for we're looking at something that's porous and not something that's solid. And so how do you define what soil is? Well, these were my children. They've all grown up. And it would be easy for them because they say soil is something to play in. Or ask an engineer and soil is something to push around, to make a road, make a dam, make an airfield. Ask a housewoman what soil is, and usually it's cleaning up after her husband. She calls it dirt. And we speak of dirty clothes, and we speak of soiled linen, dirty dishes. For some reason, soil has a bad connotation. It's the stuff you don't want, the stuff you try to get rid of in most people's minds. And a lot of people wear rubber gloves when they garden because they don't wish to get their fingernails dirty. They might have to play bridge that afternoon. I've seen women like that. And I've seen men too that don't like to really understand soil. But a true farmer loves to pick up a handful of soil and hold it and heft it and sort of weigh it in their hand as though they could tell something about its magical abilities. Ask an onion what soil is now and they'll give you a different kind of answer. For the onion will say, soil is something to hold me up so I don't fall over. Or soil is the place where I get water when I'm thirsty. Or soil provides the air for my roots to breathe. Soil provides the nutrition. Soil provides the warmth and a warm place to grow, protection against cold nights. For an onion, the soil is everything. The soil is the onion's world, just like we have an earth to live on that protects us. As we define it more specifically, we could do it on a weight basis and say, well, soil is really, by weight, mostly heavy, because it's made up of solid materials. But on the other hand, a plant does not see soil by weight. It doesn't carry it around on the end of a shovel or spade it the way we do. And so we tend to think of a volume composition instead. And if this is the whole soil, then one whole half of soil is space. And in a well-fertile garden, or a well-fertilized garden, then we're going to have half of the space filled with air and one half filled with water. And I shouldn't have said fertilized, I should have said managed. For those are the things that you manage. We don't add air to the garden, and we usually don't add water, although sometimes we irrigate. But we depend on nature most of the time. The solid portion of soil is made up 45% minerals. And the most precious thing in soils, organic matter, from which you organic farmers get your name. And that is the most complicated part, the most difficult part to understand, the most difficult part to maintain, the most difficult part to judge what you're adding, and the most difficult part to know what's been taken away. For these are the imponderables that no one seems to know how to measure. And that's what makes gardening so interesting. Because we can measure these minerals, their size, their weight, and how many there are, and how much sand and silt and clay. If you add too much water to a soil, then you exclude air. And literally, the plant roots will suffocate. If you have too much air in the soil, then obviously it's too fluffy and won't hold water. The pores will be too large and the water will drain away. And so keeping a balance between all of these things is very important. The balance may be more important than the exact amounts. In discussing soil, when you dig the hole in your garden, if you're really ambitious, you would have gone down to either bedrock or water table. The upper part of the soil is called the solum because it's nearest old soul, the sun. The topsoil has a darker color, where that's where the life of the soil is, the things that died and the things that are living and dying. We call this also topsoil. The topsoil is considered to be something like plow layer that a farmer plows. Used to be 6 inches with horses, now it's 10 inches with tractors. Seldom would you plow more than 12. So we're talking really about the top half foot. When we collect soil samples, we figure the top 6 inches weighs 2 million pounds for 1 acre, which is a fairly great weight, 20,000 tons. Beneath the topsoil, we have the subsoil, which will be different in color and lacking organic matter. Not as many roots go down there, although hopefully you'll have some. Alfalfa roots have been known to go down 100 feet. And beneath the subsoil, we will have the parent material, from which Mother Nature is still making subsoil, and from subsoil, Mother Nature is still making topsoil. And if we have erosion taking the topsoil away, then somebody will have to make some more topsoil on top of that. Soil building is a continuing process. It started when the glacier left, and it's not completed yet. The soil is an ever-changing thing. The soil is a dynamic thing. Today's soil is not tomorrow's soil. It's never the same. No 2 years are the same, for the climate differs. And down beneath here, we'll have bedrock. Hopefully, you don't have bedrock within 2 feet of the surface, or even 3. And hopefully, you will not strike water within 2 or 3 feet of the surface, because if you do, then root development will certainly be restricted. And topsoil is where many of the minerals are that have washed down from the surface. Surface soils tend to be more acid. Subsoils tend to be more alkaline. they contain more calcium and magnesium. Where do soils come from? Well, broken up rock. But it's taken eons of time for this to happen. Not just since the glacier was here, but there was soil before that, all churned up in a hodgepodge and dumped over the surface of New England. We call a lot of it glacial till. And where water is sorted out to things, we call these alluvial soils along the river. Or we might have some sandy delta soils. Soils are different depending on whether they face the sun or not. The warm side of the garden is on the south side of the hill. If you have a garden that extends over to the north side, you'll have a garden in shade. They're different worlds. Things on the north side will be those that like dampness, for this is apt to be moister. The south side will dry out sooner in the heat of the sun. It's like standing on the south side of your house or the north side. And the higher we go in elevation, the cooler the climate gets, the more rainfall we can expect. In the Champlain Valley, we have 30 inches a year. In the mountainous areas, we have 40 or 50 or 60. I imagine here, it's probably about 40. The Champlain Valley where I live is the driest area east of the Mississippi River. If it weren't so cold, we could grow cactuses, but we don't. And all of us, as we look at the garden, tend to look at the things that grow above the ground. How big the Savoy cabbage is. And by the way, I show these pictures sometimes just to whet your interest. For most beginning gardeners don't begin to plant the variety of things that you could enjoy. You tend to plant the common. But be risque when you have a garden. Try things that you've never had before. A part of the fun of gardening is doing things that nobody else grows, and then you can give them to your neighbors, and it's good for your ego. Savoy cabbage. Crinkly cabbage, very good in the summertime, not necessarily a winter keeper. But this cabbage, you see, is only a part of its plant, the whole plant. The rest is down below the surface of the soil. And so when you get down below and you look at what's there, you have a worm's eye view. And you can see roots growing, not through solid material, but coming out of the holes, the pores in the soil. Some of them are large. We call them macropores, perhaps made by worms or insects. Some of them are so small that you can't see them from where you are, but really think of soil as being like a sponge or like a sieve. And in acid New England, where a lot of leaching has gone on, many of the things that were in the soil have leached down through those holes. That's how things move from top to bottom. Without the air holes, plant roots would die, for roots have to breathe, just like you and I. When we classify the particles of soil, we say that they're made up of sand and clay, with an intermediate one which I haven't shown called silt. And I didn't put silt here because physically and chemically speaking, sand is like little glass beads in the soil. It's made up of glass, silicon dioxide. And really no chemistry takes part on the surface of the sand, nor does it on the silt, for the silt is superfine sand grains. Clay, on the other hand, is composed of a different kind of material. It's like little stacks of dinner plates stacked up together. Each individual clay particle is so small that you can only see it with an electron microscope. It's an expanding lattice, and even ions of different nutrients can go in between. And so when you look at clay, you don't see clay per se, but you see little groups of clay particles, lumps, granules, blocks, and prisms that are described in different ways. And what we try to do in a good soil that's made up of too much clay is to try to make the clay clump together so that we have spaces around the clumps of clay and make the clay clumps behave something like the sand grains, which allow spaces for water and air to pass. The sand is a well-aerated soil. It's a well-drained soil because liquids and gases can move freely. But if you allow the clay particles to all become fused together, you'll have something akin to concrete. You won't be able to spade or use a hoe or even make a row to plant seeds. But if you work the clay at the proper content and you keep the organic level up so that you can make these little granules and keep them as such, then clay will behave like sand and you can grow a fairly good garden even on clay. My gardens are all clay, and I don't walk in them for maybe 3 days after it rains. And so we have these extremes. of garden soil. Actually, the best garden soil is not pure sand, but the soils that are on the sandy side. For every soil consists of sand and silt and clay in varying proportions. And I show you simply a pile of sand to illustrate it's a soil, how sandy soil can be. On the other hand, we can have this kind of stuff. And we have this in abundance through the Champlain Valley, more so than the rest of New England. And difficult to grow crops, especially in years of heavy rainfall, and difficult to grow crops, especially if we don't manage the soil right. Because once made together, and we call it puddling, like this, playing with the soil when it's too wet, the stuff bakes out and literally is like a concrete sidewalk. So you'd wish not to have the extremes. You'd like to have something in the middle. And so here is a triangle called the textural triangle that one can use as sort of a pretty thing. It measures the percent clay on one axis, the percent silt on the other axis, and the percent sand across the bottom. Since we want the soil to be sandy, then we would look for something called sandy loam as perhaps being the best of all worlds, where the clay content is less than 20% and the silt content is maybe less than 20% and the sand is something like 60 to 70%. That's very good because you can go out and play with that soil anytime, and yet it has enough body with the silt and the clay to do the things that need to be done chemically, and especially if you add organic matter to it, which will add to its chemical potential a great deal more. Soils that are more than 20% clay are all on the sticky side, and you'll be unhappy gardening in those soils unless you manage them very, very carefully. Soils that have more than 70% sand, and we change the name then to a loamy sand, or pure sand, are really too sandy, and you'll have difficulty maintaining organic matter and maintaining water. Well, what's a loam? A loam is described as the happy medium. Loam doesn't say rich, it doesn't say black, it doesn't say fertile, it doesn't say anything, except that the stickiness of the clay is counterbalanced by the grittiness of the sand and vice versa. And you say, well, why don't I want the loam? Well, the loam is okay, there's nothing about it that's bad, and most farmers deal with loam. But you'll notice that most of the vegetable soils, the river valley bottoms, the deltas that we use, the old sand beaches, are really preferred for vegetable gardening. And so you try to have a sandy loam if you possibly can. But if you can't, you make the best of what you have, and I'm trying to garden over here with silty clay, which is a difficult thing, but it does grow plants. We describe the water capabilities of the soil according to the depth of the water table, but really when we're talking about water, we're really talking about air, for air and water are the converse of each other. We don't talk enough about air, and we talk too much about water. We use words like poorly drained, well-drained, moderately well-drained, and what we really mean is poorly aerated, well-aerated, and so on. So soils are gathered into families of sorts, and if you had a soil divided into 4 parts, we'll say, up the side of a hill, this little table is a catena, C-A-T-E-N-A, a drainage catena. The soil is all the same except the water content differs because the bottom part is close to the water. In fact, it's growing cattails. That would be very poorly drained. And then here's a poorly drained one in which the soil does not get enough air even within the top foot, and moderately well drained in which the water table is down so that the roots can go without contacting it, perhaps for 18 inches. And the well drained, they ought to be able to go down 3 feet or more. So really depth of the water table, which in a sense influences the air supply, characterizes these soils, and I'll show you how you can identify them. Believe it or not, that's a soil. It has a name. I believe it's named after Colton, Massachusetts. Is there a Colton? If not, then Colton, New York. And that would be the graveliest, sandiest, driest, most infertile, poorest soil I could think of in Vermont. Colton soil. But look, it has a topsoil from accumulation of organic matter. And because of that organic matter, it is a soil. It was a pasture, now it's growing up to gray birch. It wouldn't be good for gardening, but it does grow things. At the other extreme is one of the areas in which I did garden a few years ago. and we did have a very wet summer. I did have peppers and eggplants growing in this soil. They did sit out there in puddles of water for about 3 weeks. I did finally dig up the plants and transfer them to drier ground, and they did produce a crop, but obviously it was not under the best of conditions. Had I not done some hoeing around these before the water came and had these little hills, the roots would have been completely submerged and they probably would have died. And when you have wet soil such as that, you encounter all kinds of diseases, particularly Phytophthora. I can say it. I can even spell it if asked. Phytophthora, which is a wet soil disease, and it attacks the roots of plants and literally eats the roots off the bean plants in this case. This happened in the same year of the previous picture, and I could just go out and take the bean plant and lift it out as though it were a soda straw that I'd stuck in the soil. There was no root to hold the plant at all. The plants would have died had I not pulled them out, and obviously they did after I pulled. One can avoid wetness sometimes, if you have such a thing, by digging a perimeter ditch around and draining the water away so that water can't get on your garden, and the garden will drain into the ditch. You can do it by internal drainage by putting porous tile underneath, either usually plastic these days, perforated with holes. Or you can do this by making raised beds. And the beds then will be raised maybe 6 inches above the general level, giving an area for the roots to grow so that they can breathe. And how do you tell whether a soil is poorly drained or not? Well, nature has provided a very handy indicator. And this indicator happens to be iron, which is present in all soils. Iron, as you know, is rusty. But if it isn't rusty, it'll be the color of a new nail, nice and bright and shiny, sort of, or at least gray, cast iron. If you look at a soil and you see a dead gray color, you can say, well, there was not enough air in this soil to rust the iron. And therefore, the iron remains dull gray, like cast iron. We call this the reduced form. And in that form, it can actually be somewhat toxic to plants, even though it's a plant nutrient. On the other hand, if you dig a hole in your garden and you found a nice, rich coffee brown due to the redness of the iron becoming rusty, now you can say, aha, that soil has had plenty of air all the time for the last 10,000 years. See, this is not something changes from day to day. It's a long time indicator. This soil then is well drained because I can see down there at least 3 feet that there's been plenty of air to rust the iron. And if so, then there has been plenty of air, and there will be, to grow a proper plant. We also talked about the structure of the soil. Now, the first thing we talked about was texture. Texture was sand, silt, clay. Size of particles alone. The structure of the soil is the arrangement of the particles. You can't do much about the texture of your soil. You take what is given, unless you haul in stuff by the truckload. And it takes a lot of sand to change a clay soil into a sandy soil. You can't afford it. But on the other hand, if you want to arrange the particles and make them so they're more conducive to plant growth, you have a lot of leeway in making a good soil or a bad soil. The structure of the soil should be that we have granules, each made up of little particles of sand and silt and clay, all jumbled together. And hopefully these will be interlaced with root hairs, because the roots will penetrate these structural units. Humus from decomposing organic matter coating the particles of these structural units, and indeed they won't break down under the impact of raindrops as easily. For humus is nature's glue that holds these things together. If you have some of these without glue, and I used to do this in soils class, you put these things in water, and water will immediately start to penetrate from the outside, from all directions, and will actually create a pressure on the inside of the granule, and when the pressure becomes so great, the whole thing will and explode. A little explosion. It's kind of interesting to watch. But if you have humus present, the water can penetrate and the glue will hold it together so it stays that way. So that's an important function of organic matter. And around these granules then we have created macropores for air and water so that there can be movement from down and up. Gases can move both ways. Yes?
Can I ask a question now?
Well, I don't know about the taping, and I think I would prefer kind of to do the whole thing because of the taping.
Okay.
You'll have to ask them. And so if you could hold it till the end, I think they'd appreciate it. One way to create structure is by mechanical means, by hoeing, by spacing. and by plowing. We can create structure, but likewise we can destroy structure by improper management. And then the creation of structure, we not only want to mechanically move the soil into granules and break it up into the size we want, but at the same time, if you can incorporate organic matter, which you organic farmers do, then you will maintain the organic supply and create new supplies of humus to make more glue. Rototilling is perhaps one of the better ways to create structure. But remember that you never play with the soil when the soil is too wet. And don't play with it when it's too dry. In one case you produce clods, in the other case you produce something like pancake batter, which is going to get hard when it dries. So if you play with the soil at the proper moisture content, you can create the structure. Rototilling then will break it up, make it into granules, and as many passes as you make, it keeps getting finer and finer. But don't over-rototill. You only want to break it up to the point where the consistency is what you want. You can also maintain structure with a hoe by loosening the soil around plants. And this serves the function of breaking up the capillary connections so that when you hoe around the plant and loosen the surface soil, water cannot wick all the way to the top. You'll have a sort of a dust mulch around the top, which will save water, which otherwise would come to the surface of solid soil and be lost. And also you catch a few weeds. If you play with soil at the wrong moisture content, and then it subsequently dries, you'll have something that looks like this. The clay will tend to break into usually hexagonal patterns. These aren't very hexagonal, but at least it's not very conducive for something to grow. One little seed is trying, but you certainly don't want your seed bed to look like that. Instead, you want your seed bed to be loose and granular, and particularly for plants that come up like a bean plant comes up in the crooked neck stage, which you see here, and literally has to push the whole bean through the soil. And if you had a hard soil like that other one, it would be like me trying to stand up in a low ceiling. I'd bump my head on that crust on the surface. But if the soil is loose, then it can easily push the granules aside and move on through. And eventually the bean will straighten right up, and you'll see the two cotyledons at the top. On the other hand, things like grasses and leeks coming through with a point, particularly corn is a better example, comes up through the soil like a spear. Corn can come through a much harder soil than beans. Beans are a large seed and require a very loose soil. We also have compaction of soils. When you walk on soil, you compact it, not only on the surface but down below. And in the case of tractors, this is compaction that's down at the bottom of the plow layer, where a farmer's heavy tractor actually made the soil like concrete 6 inches down. And trying to push a soil probe into the soil, it goes easily for the first 4 to 6 inches, and then boom, you hit that hard layer. So we need to have a loose soil in depth. And that's very important to a crop, and especially those deep-rooted crops like carrots. This is from my soil. This carrot hit a hard layer down below. Because when I plow with my Ford tractor, the plow makes a slick in the bottom of the furrow. That hardens, and there is some compaction even with an 8N Ford. And these carrots go down, and boom, that's it. And if you grow a deep-rooted crop like a parsnip, which is something like alfalfa, the roots on a parsnip are unbelievably long. This is my soil too, in a different place. And these things probably are, I don't know, 6 feet long. They're huge. When you dig a parsnip, you probably break most of it off up here, and you think you have a long-rooted crop, but you haven't seen anything yet till you go way to the bottom and get one. So people never really see how far down plant roots will grow. I don't know why one slide didn't drop, so we'll skip it. Now, how do you tell when soil is at the proper moisture content? Well, I showed you the soil first, which you didn't see. You pick up a handful, and you give it a squeeze. Squeeze it hard. And when you open your hand, it should have had enough moisture to retain itself in a ball, the form that you squeezed. And then you ought to be able to take your thumb and kind of go like this, and the ball will break apart very easily. In other words, you really haven't compacted it much. You've only squeezed the granules together. And when you open your hand, the soil should be pretty much like it was before you did it. This then tells you that the soil is not so moist that it forms a hard ball that won't fall apart, and not so dry that you can't form the ball. At that point, you can really improve the structure of a soil by rototilling, by spading, by churning it with a rake, or however you wish to do it. And that's when farmers should be plowing. At that kind of a moisture content, you'll find that most life exists and is happiest, including the earthworms. And incidentally, earthworms are called nature's plowmen. I don't know why plow women. You can't say either one because worms are hermaphrodites. They're both sexes. So these its actually do a great job in churning up soil and turning it over and creating the macropores and leaving behind the worm casts, which in a sense are the worm manure, which are great for fertilization. I noticed that worm casts are being sold over here in packages. You don't have to buy them in packages. You can grow your own. You don't have to buy earthworms to put into your garden. If you have to buy earthworms for your garden, it says that there was something wrong with the garden in the first place, and the poor things had nothing to eat. You add sufficient organic matter to the garden, and you will have a few worms, and they'll reproduce, being both male and female all the time, and you'll have an earthworm explosion, a population explosion. You can make more worms grow in your garden than you can buy in a bag, and it's a heck of a lot cheaper. Just feed them, and they'll do their thing. We also have fungi in the soil that are important to the growth of all plants. And these have roots, mycelia, that creep and crawl through the soil, and sometimes even into the roots of plants where they live in a pleasant association. You see, the life beneath the soil, which is what you organic people are much concerned about, is a very important thing to the success of a garden. Without that life, you would really have no garden. Remember when they went to the moon and somebody said they brought back soil from the moon? That wasn't soil. That was moon dust. You can't have soil without having life. By very definition, soil is something that is alive. And if you've killed everything by sterilization or you got it from the moon, it's not soil anymore. It's just dust or ground up rock powder. But if you think of all the organisms beneath the surface, and I used to do this with dairy farmers, here's a cow on the top. I don't know if it's a Holstein, but it could be, weighing 1,300 pounds, or maybe a Jersey Guernsey that weighs 1,000 or less. But let's say 1,000 pounds, cow. Beneath the surface of the ground, we have 300 pounds of insects, 200 pounds of earthworms, 500 pounds of bacteria, protozoa, nematodes, and 1,000 pounds of fungi. We're talking about 2,000 pounds below the ground for every 1,000 animal on top. And so I tell a farmer with a 100-cow farm, you've really got 300 head of livestock. 300 head instead of 100. Only 2 of them are down where you can't see. And these all have to be fed, just like the ones on the top. And what do you feed them? You feed them organic matter, either by growing it, plowing it under, green manure, or by adding it in the form of cow manure or compost, or however you do it. That 5% of organic matter is extremely important to the success of a garden. And the things you can use for organic matter could be something as easily obtained as old leaves. Now, of course, you're robbing the forest, robbing Peter to pay Paul, but on the other hand, these wouldn't have gotten back into the forest by themselves along the stone wall, so gather them up and use them with good conscience in your garden. Organic matter in soils tends to make soils dark. It tends to make the soil warmer, if you will. And we actually have some soils that have so much organic matter that they're black. And if they're black enough, we call them peat. It's not good to maintain that much organic matter in a soil, and usually the dark color indicates a soil of poor drainage. But maintaining that 5% instead of 10 or 15 or 20 is important. I've seen lousy organic gardens that were practically manure piles with some soil in them. That's not good. We still do best on a mineral soil with 5% organic matter. Some people would say, well, I'll just burn the leaves and put the ashes on. Won't that be just as good? You get the minerals, but you've lost all the nitrogen and sulfur in the smoke, and you've denied the organisms in the soil all of the carbohydrates and vitamins and foods that we saw on that food chart, because they need the nourishment that's in those things. You can take things that don't look pleasant, that don't seem to be very good for a garden, shavings, sawdust, bark, hay, straw, and you can turn them into compost. So compost is really partially digested material, and you can either do it in a compost pile, which is sort of an unnatural procedure, although you think it's natural, I consider it a ritual for organic people, not necessary. Our researcher at Vermont has shown that if you take the same organic matter and put it in a compost pile compared to putting it in the soil it will do better, because you are feeding the bacteria that are going to be in your garden. When you put it in a compost pile, you're feeding a bunch of strangers that had nothing to do with your garden, and the heat evolved will be wasted from the compost pile. You should have had the heat saved for your garden, and you should have saved all of the nutrition for your garden organisms. So I have mixed feelings about composting. But if you want to get rid of diseases, weed seeds, and you want to take something that's in big pieces and make it into small pieces like coffee grounds by composting, great. There are some reasons for it and some reasons against it. But whatever you do when you compost or put things in your garden, make sure that you feed your plants a balanced diet. We humans speak of the right proportion of protein and carbohydrate. We Americans eat more protein than we should, but a certain amount is important. And so in chemistry of soil, we talk about carbon and nitrogen. Carbon is the carbohydrate and nitrogen is the protein. And this ratio should be, for ideal purposes, about 1 to 40. Something about like green rye, which is 1 to 36. That's the same, close. But on the other hand, if we put too much sawdust in the garden, we've way overdone the carbohydrate. It would be like bringing a kid up on sugar all the time and never giving them much else to eat. And the same is true for straw, although not to the same degree. On the other hand, if we gave something to a person, just plain steak all the time, or hamburger or hot dogs, it would be like giving your soil only the clover and the manure, because here the ratio is too rich on the nitrogen side. And isn't it a fortuitous circumstance that the dairy industry in New England has cows that have to be bedded with straw or sawdust, and that the cows make manure, the unavoidable, and that the two of them mixed together brings the high protein with the high carbohydrate, and the two of them come out to be something like green rye? Just by accident. They've been doing it right all the time. I gave a lot of talks 100 times on the miracles of manure, or the perishability and the profitability of manure. And I love this cartoon that I had made for me, for it bespeaks the things that organic matter, and especially manure, does. It furnishes nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash, NPK. Anybody know why K is for potash? It's not because I can't spell. It comes from the Latin word kalium, that means earth. It also contains every micronutrient, from boron to zinc. When composted, it can be used as a mulch. It supplies food for organisms. It supplies the organic matter for the physical properties that we mentioned. It darkens the soil and makes it warmer, which is important to all of the hot weather vegetables. And it contains what we call the fecal factor. That's the vitamins and the hormones and the stuff that even scientists can't decipher yet. One of our researchers calls those the fecal factor. And that's an important virtue to organic matter that you can't find in a chemical fertilizer bag. Maybe you can find it in seaweed. Making compost is something that you're all familiar with. Do it if you want, feel good about it if you do, realizing that it has some virtue, and some virtues that you think it has, it doesn't. You can use it as mulch on the surface of the ground. Ruth Stout wrote books about mulching gardens. It's highly recommended. It protects the moisture level in the soil, for one thing, and prevents weeds from growing. And it's been well shown that if you want to grow healthy tomatoes that don't have cracks around the stem like these, mulch will keep a uniform moisture supply, which will in turn induce a regular nutrient supply, particularly of potassium and calcium. And that this cracking you won't see, which is kind of a physical thing. You won't see the greening around the tops, which is a potassium thing, and you won't see blossom end rot, which is a calcium deficiency. All of those problems with tomatoes can be quite largely eliminated. I won't say completely, but quite largely eliminated simply by the use of a mulch to conserve water. A great virtue for organics. And we use mulch sometimes around asparagus. I know a woman who has an asparagus patch, and she doesn't even have this many weeds. I've known her for 35 years. She was the head of the Organic Farming and Gardening Association in Vermont. I have never seen asparagus that was so weed-free as hers. And she did it with a mulch that was something like this. We also think of the temperature of the soil. And think of temperatures as being something like the temperatures that we enjoy. plants become alive at 40 degrees. The grass starts to green. At 60 degrees, well, you can plant beans. At 50 degrees, you can plant corn. But really, most things grow best when the temperature is 70, where we enjoy comfort. And when things are really booming in the summer, you have temperatures of 80, maybe up to 100. And so there are all ways to increase the temperature of soil and try to get from 40 up to something that's a lot warmer. But we tend to play the season, and we plant as early as we can. And a lot of the things we plant, you see, we're growing plants under a temperature adversity. And so to make things grow better, we use plastic in different ways. Black plastic will not warm the soil. This black or clear. Clear plastic will warm the soil. There's a difference between the two. One of my agents gave me a big argument about that one time. But if you want to grow peppers and eggplant and muskmelons, the warm weather plants, including tomatoes, then you should use black plastic, for the sun will hit the plastic and keep the air temperature warmer around the plant. They did this in Alaska and increased the air temperature by about 2 degrees and doubled the crop. Peppers are especially heat-loving. You can make more heat with an old tire if you want. Maybe it's not ecological, and maybe you don't like the stuff the rubber does for soil, but plants do grow fast in a rubber tire. They protect it from the wind, they get a lot of heat, they hold the heat for nighttime and give it back to the plant and protect the water loss as well. And so for the finest tomatoes, you can do that. But on the other hand, don't figure that it's going to work for the cool weather crops like lettuce. Lettuce does not grow well in heat, and therefore you should keep the black away from it. But you could do it for your eggplant because they are a heat-loving plant. And don't for a minute forget that every single thing you grow in the garden, with few exceptions, came from a part of the world that was warmer than it is in Massachusetts and especially in Vermont. You know, our plants all came from the Mediterranean, from India, from the Middle East, South America. They weren't native to Vermont. All we grew here were trees. And we're trying to grow vegetables in a place that Mother Nature intended trees should grow. And so if you want eggplant, pay attention to the heat. If you want warmer soil, then use clear plastic. I did an experiment with 22 vegetables one year, and I found on a summer day the temperature outside would be something like 50 degrees, that is in the soil outside, and under the plastic would be 15 degrees warmer on any given day. So you can plant sweet corn earlier. And in a University of Massachusetts experiment, this was the corn with plastic and this was the corn that wasn't. Both planted the same day, the same variety, and everything else the same. And this is the way commercial sweet corn growers get their crop off to an earlier start and hit the market when the price is high, for that's when the profits are to be made. All kinds of plastics that are being described at this conference, people have been speaking on them. And so really you can control the environment above and below the ground. And if you don't want to buy these things, you can oftentimes make do with what you have, as this woman did with paper bags, or this woman did with plastic milk bottles over her tomatoes. Be sure to take the cap off, though, so that the heat doesn't stay inside. And I've heard if you really want a good tomato plant, you dig a hole 3 feet deep, put in 1.5 feet of horse manure, which gives off lots of heat, cover it with 6 inches of soil, plant your tomato, and you're still below the ground, and then turn a gallon mayonnaise jar over the top and watch that plant grow straight up. We call it etiolation, trying to reach that light. And with all that heat under it, it really takes off. And above all, don't try to grow a garden in shade. Because if you grow a garden in shade, you will not have the benefit of the energy from the sun. The vitamin C content of tomatoes is more closely correlated with sunlight than any other thing. And because we do need the heat as well as the light, and most of our vegetables are designed not to be shade-loving, then we should have everything out in the open sun as much as we possibly can. And if we had long days like Alaska, we'd have better gardens than we do. 18-hour days would be better than 16, and 16 are better than 12. Now it's amazing to me when I say the soil makes the garden, that people can plant things, and these are 2 community gardeners side by side, and that one gardener knows how to grow corn like that and the other gardener grows corn like that. That's the difference between 2 people and the way they did it. Now I don't know what they did. Obviously one didn't do much. and probably wasn't even organic, but just didn't do things. I took a European trip, and one guy kept bragging all the time about how he did this and how he did that, and finally I said, "You're not really organic, you're just too damn chintzy to buy fertilizer." And that's what he was trying to do. And we used to talk about God's half acre when people said they were organic, and the scientific community said, "Well, that's doing nothing." No, organic is not doing nothing. Organic is doing something. It's doing a lot of things, but it's doing different things than the scientific chemical community does. And so whatever was done, the soil made the garden for that guy, and not for this one. As we talk about plant nutrition, plants need the same kinds of nutrients we do, with few exceptions. They need nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. Those are the big three. We call them major plant nutrients. And then we have the secondary nutrients, calcium and magnesium obtained from dolomitic limestone, and sulfur, which we get from air and also from organic matter. Iron and zinc and copper and chlorine and manganese and sodium, molybdenum and boron, and there are scientists that think there are some beyond those, like chromium, although we don't know much about that yet, and vanadium, perhaps. And in addition, we need selenium in our diet that plants don't seem to respond to. All of these things are found in a pile of manure. Only nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash, and maybe some calcium and sulfur are found in a bag of commercial fertilizer. One can easily vote for organics as being superior to chemical fertilization, for chemical fertilization is always incomplete. Always. And how do we keep these things in the soil? Well, we set a proper table. And we want it to be there, not swept off on the floor before the plant grows. As we use fertilizers, and you'll use this in a loose sense, I should use the word fertility for you. As we use fertility and lime, we add to the soil the collection of these things that I call plant goodies. And if it were not for the fact that the soil has a special property called cation exchange, these things would disappear with the first time water ran through the soil. But you can run water through a soil and you don't leach out the things that we've shown here, because all of these goodies have a positive charge, and the clay particles that are hexagonal plates and the humus globs all have a negative charge, and positives and negatives are attracted and will be held against the leaching action of water by an electrostatic force. And then, as the plant grows and gives off carbon dioxide, which mixes with water to make carbonic acid, H2CO3, the H splits off and comes over here and is attracted with greater affinity to this glob of organic matter than is the calcium or the copper or the potassium. And the hydrogen gets on, and these things get off and get into solution and are taken up by the plant. So this exchange thing between the plant and the soil particles is an important part of the soil chemistry. Vermont soils were never rich in the first place. True for all New England. Our soils were acid, they were devoid of phosphorus, they were rather low in fertility, especially potassium. Indians knew that. They used wood ashes to grow better corn and put a fish under every hill, and that supplied the things they need. But in the last 10,000 years, we've had a lot of rain in Vermont. And that rain, in addition to natural fermentation of the organic matter at the top, has caused hydrogen ions to come down through the soil, gradually displacing and moving all of the things ever lower and lower and lower. The soil is like the coffee pot. You make coffee once and you throw the grounds away. It rained lots of times in the last 8,000 years. We didn't throw the soil away. The soil is still here, getting poorer and poorer and poorer. How would you like to make coffee for the 50th time with the same grounds? It would be pretty weak. And so our soils in Vermont tend to look like a three-colored cat before white people came. And we had a dark layer with organic matter. We had a highly leached layer in the middle. And then we had another layer where some of the iron accumulated. The black and the white and the red. The old-timers thought that was ashes at first, but it's not. It's pure white quartz sand. So New England soils are described as being responsive to fertilizer. It sounds like a virtue that we had. But what it means is that they were so damned poor in the first place that anything you put on is bound to improve them and make them better for growing plants. And so these soils then that contained all of this hydrogen that had climbed on these soil colloids over 8,000 years of time since glacier, and precious little calcium and other nutrients remained, we now start to manage this garden by adding organic matter, and commercial farmers have added commercial fertilizers until we, in a good garden, will replace the nutrients that Mother Nature had taken away and give the plant a balanced diet with all of the nutrients that you saw on the chart. But we still will have a hard, difficult time keeping nitrates in the soil, for they tend to get lost because they're negatively charged, and the sulfate ions, which is sulfur, from getting lost, and so it disappears, and also the chloride, which would furnish chlorine. And in the process, we have some problems with the contaminants we've added from fungicides like mercury and lead and cadmium and copper and zinc, for they too stick to the soil particles. Don't feed your sheep with clippings from the local golf course, for example, because the putting greens are extremely high in those bad things. But this is called ion exchange, and it is nature's storehouse for holding on to plant nutrients until the plants need it. I don't know why I put this one in, but this was an insect control measure that I tried by adding dolomitic limestone to the top of my potatoes. I did that 6 times one year, and I really do believe that it kept them away. The man who told me about it is long since dead, and he said that as the potato beetle eats the leaves, it will gorge itself on the dolomitic limestone, which will change the pH of its digestive system, and it won't be able to utilize its food. I don't know if it works or not. I've not tried it many years, but I put it in there. In a sense, it's related to nutrition because I was putting some lime on the potatoes at the same time. As we use lime on the soil, remember that the purpose of lime is that it's an alkali and will neutralize soil acidity, and at the same time add calcium, the plant nutrient, and if you use dolomitic limestone, it will furnish magnesium. And you have an abundance of it here at Lee, Massachusetts. That's where we happen to get ours. As we talk about soil acidity, we should explain briefly that soil acidity is a yardstick with numbers going from 0 to 14. 7 is halfway in the middle. We call it neutral. Anything less than 7 is acid. Anything higher than 7 is alkali. Alkalis are the opposites of acids. You know that lemons are acid. And so at 2, that's the acidity of lemons. At 1, that's hydrochloric acid, or battery acid. They will eat holes in your clothes. As you move towards 7, things become less acid. Now this really measures the logarithm of the concentration of hydrogen ions in the soil. It measures the degree of acidity. And this funny yardstick works backwards. The smaller the number, the greater the acidity. This funny yardstick goes by tens. 6 is 10 times as acid as 7. 5 is 100 times as acid as 7. And 4 is 1,000 times as acid as 7. That's a queer yardstick, and people have trouble understanding it. Where we're trying to grow plants, best for the growth of gardens and commercial vegetables would be something about 6.5. And that's what we try to achieve. Unfortunately, most New England soils are 5 or less to start with. And so you must add 50 pounds of ground limestone per 1,000 square feet at least once and maybe twice or 3 times to get it up to this desirable position. With limestone, which is 8.3 itself, you're not very apt to get it very high because it's quite impractical to get the pH above 7 with limestone. You will never do any harm by liming your garden. However, if you try to use wood ashes that have a pH of 13, it's possible to run your pH to 10, and you'll certainly be in trouble. Wood ashes are good, but be very careful of the amount, and ideally, you should know something about soil test. Remember that when you lime something, lime is simply ground up rock. It takes a long time for it to dissolve, maybe 6 months, a year, or 2, or 3. It works at a snail's pace, if that sticks in your mind. And the benefits of liming are that it speeds up the action of bacteria. They decompose the organic matter that you've added faster. For the idea of organic matter in a soil is not just to change the structure, but to have it broken down to release the nutrients and make the whole merry-go-round work. And indeed, it makes chemical fertilizers work better too. We also have soil poisons. Aluminum, which is not a nutrient, manganese and iron, which are toxic under reduced air conditions. And liming can help to prevent those things. Here is a soil pH 5. The crop is crimson clover. The middle pail had commercial fertilizer like a 5-10-10, but it didn't do its stuff. Pail number 3 had limestone added in addition to the fertilizer. And see what it did. And why were the tops bigger over here? Well, because the bottoms were bigger there. The limestone did something to the soil because the one without anything had inhibited root growth. And we think now that that was aluminum being toxic to the roots, and by liming the soil, we raised the pH and made aluminum less soluble. Where do you put lime? And this will help you answer the question. In these pails, the researcher put lime on the surface, but not on the bottom. And that's where he got roots. In pail number 9, he put lime on the top and the bottom, but none in the middle. And see where the roots grew. In pail number 8, he put it in the bottom 3/4, but he didn't put it in the top, and that's where the roots grew. Now, so you never have to ask anybody again, where should I put lime in my soil? Should I put it on the surface, or should I rototill it in? You mix it as deeply and as thoroughly as you can, and you do it about once every 3rd year. 50 pounds per thousand is a good number to start with. Your soil test may something different. When you lime your garden, you're going to improve the availability of all of the plant nutrients. Here's the magic 6.5 to 7 that we want, right through the middle. The width of the band shows you how much is available to the plant. In acid soils, below pH of 6, phosphorus is very unavailable. You reach the magical 6 and it becomes to be quite available. And at 6.5 is just about perfect for phosphorus. It's also good for nitrogen, potassium, sulfur, and even higher would be better for calcium and magnesium. On the other hand, you don't wish to lime your soil more than 7, because if you do, you begin to reduce the supply of iron, manganese, boron, copper, zinc, but then molybdenum behaves like the ones above. So for each nutrient, there is a specific pH at which it is most available. And this kind of table is available for you to look at and understand. If you do use wood ashes, and this happens to be my stove with my wood ashes at harvest time, I save the wood ashes, and they can be used in various ways. But when you use them, you will find that in most cases, they're approximately half as good as limestone in terms of their neutralizing value. Now, they ought to be twice as good. But the trouble is, most people leave their wood ashes out, and they pick up moisture from the atmosphere, which dilutes them, and they pick up carbon dioxide, which dilutes them, so that in the end, they're not as good as limestone. In Vermont, we have a big wood chip plant, and we've been successful in taking 50,000 tons of wood ash, mixing it with limestone for commercial farmers, and farmers are now buying a mixture of both and enjoying all the advantages of both ashes and lime at the same time. Raising the pH is extremely beneficial to all of the legumes, especially, like these Italian beans, which grew up about 12 feet tall. On the other hand, we have acid-loving plants like blueberries. You don't lime blueberries. Why? Blueberries have an unusually high demand for iron. How do you make iron available? You want the soil to be acid, so the iron will be dissolved. So some of you may have soils that are not even acid enough for blueberries, and you may wish to make them more acid. Oak leaves will help. Pine needles will help. Sulfur will work a lot faster. Or even alum aluminum sulfate. See, that's a chemical that you would not choose. But you must acidify soil for blueberries so they will get enough iron. You can also spray iron on the leaves. On the other hand, we have a crop, potatoes, and we don't wish to lime the potatoes, because when we do, we increase the conditions for potato scab. And all commercial potato growers are deathly afraid of liming a soil, and yet liming it would grow better potatoes. But it also grows better scab. There is a new theory, and I'm trying it in my garden this year, that if the manganese level is high enough, the scab will not flourish even if I use lime. And incidentally, fresh manure will also induce potato scab, and so don't put fresh manure on your potato patch. Grow your potatoes in a special place, and you'll probably be more free of scab, and also buy scab-free seed. And above all, I would encourage you to use a soil test. Every state has one. You have independent ones like Land's End, or you can buy kits that you do yourself. I would encourage you to have it done someplace because of greater precision, greater reliability, and also a more useful interpretation. But if you just want to learn and play, then you can buy one to do yourself. Now, in terms of the plant nutrients, when the plants don't have what they need, they show symptoms the same way as humans, like with chicken pox. I'm going home, I have a grandson that's coming, and he's been exposed to chicken pox. So my son who's coming says, you know, hey grandparents, do you mind having chicken pox around? Well, he's got to have them. We've all had them, so it doesn't matter. And so it's inevitable sometimes that you will see deficiency symptoms. When the plant is deficient in potassium, you will see the outer edge of the leaf turn brown. When the plant is deficient in magnesium, you'll have stripes on the leaves because the area between the veins will turn yellow. So there's potassium deficiency and magnesium deficiency right at the same time. This is potassium deficiency on a squash, and it affects the outer margin of the leaf to a greater degree than the center. And this is potassium deficiency on cucumbers, whereas they become progressively more sick. They come out finally looking like ping pong balls with a little nipple on them. And usually you see this toward the end of the crop because they take a fantastic amount of potassium out of the soil. All of these juicy fruits in the garden, as I call them, have a great potassium need. And you people have a great problem because you won't use potassium chloride, which is the Canadian source, the commercial source of potassium. You won't use potassium sulfate. You may use some stuff called langbeinite that comes from Carlsbad, New Mexico. It's now been declared natural. It is a naturally occurring salt. But if you don't do that, potassium is a little bit difficult for you. And granite dust and green sand, about which there's so much conversation, are really poor sources. They don't contain much, and it's not very available. So you need to keep your potassium up some way. Composts and manures can help, and wood ashes. And wood ashes were used for potash to ship to England in the early days. So wood ashes for you would be much better than lime because they provide you a source of potassium as well as neutralizing the soil and furnishing calcium and magnesium. If you don't get enough potassium, you'll find these hard layers around the top of your tomato. You have to cut it off and throw it away. It doesn't can well. Here's the magnesium on corn deficiency again. I've seen a lot of these over 35 years, and I've tried to save the best of my slides. And one nutrient that's especially important in a garden, and this again is a little more difficult for you won't accept superphosphate. I see no harm. But I respect your view. And if you want to use rock phosphate, use more, place it better, use it more often, and obviously it'll work, as will bone meal. The thing to remember about the three major nutrients is nitrogen does not stay in the soil and tends to be lost. Phosphorus stays where you put it, right near the surface if that's where it is. And potash will stay in the soil only as long as it bounces from clay particle to clay particle like a ping pong ball. But eventually it drops, hence slow speed down like the umbrella. Plants use more nitrogen than they do phosphorus or potash, so the size of my characters here is connotative. Maybe 3 and 1 and 2 as a proportion, although this varies with the crop. And with a legume crop, you never would put the nitrogen on because it makes its own. So this might just be 0. But for most crops in the garden, you'd have to supply nitrogen. Nitrogen is a plant stimulant, like sugar. Quick go. Or maybe some drugs, although some are depressants. Phosphorus is the root former. And if ever you're going to need phosphorus, it's when you start a baby plant. Potash is the sugar former and also helps to prevent disease. And potash is related to how much carbohydrate you can make. Now, if you could remember those things, and I've said them quickly, they might give you some clue as to what plants you need more of one thing or another. When you don't put phosphorus close to the root, because now remember it never moves in the soil, you should actually take rock phosphate, mix it with the soil in the row where you plant, dust your seeds with it, coat your seeds with it, anything you can to get it close to that baby root when it first starts. Because if you don't, that root will always be handicapped, and so will the plant. I grew dry beans commercially for 7 years. I made 10,000 pounds one time. I wanted my children to have a family enterprise. And just for you, because I knew I was coming here in 1958, I planted this row of beans and I left out what we call starter fertilizer, which would be phosphorus put down with the seed or close by. And look what happened to that row of beans as opposed to these. A dramatic difference. And never can you go back and put more phosphorus on later and say, oh, I forgot, I'll do it tomorrow. Because those stunted plants will never catch up with the ones that had it. You cannot make up for lost time in the garden. So do it right the first time, or preferably before you plant. Without adequate phosphorus, plants will turn out with purple leaves. And what you don't see in this picture is that the plant will be tremendously stunted, as you saw with my beans. One didn't drop, but we'll forget it. Now, nitrogen. Nitrogen comes from the sky in the form of lightning affecting the nitrogen supply and bringing it down as acid rain. It forms nitrate, and that's what a plant can use. We also have special bacteria called azotobacter, and they can take nitrogen from the soil air and leave it in the soil for your plants to use. This amounts to about 10 to 30 pounds per year. This amounts to about 10 to 20 pounds per year worldwide. And you get those whether you want them or not, providing you have a reasonably normal soil. But then if you grow some kind of legume in the garden, you can produce as much as 200 or 300 pounds per acre. Now we're really talking big numbers, because plants are going to require something more than 100 pounds, 150 pounds or upward per year to grow well. And we won't even talk about the chemical supply, which is how commercial farmers get theirs. So you're going to depend really upon specialized bacteria to take nitrogen from the air that's all around us and from soil air and turn it into useful proteinaceous substances. And those bacteria will live mostly on the roots of plants. Also, you will get nitrogen by adding anything that has protein. Hair, shoe leather, compost, fish meal, almost everything except sawdust and straw. There will be some nitrogen in almost everything, but some are especially high. And so you try to choose those. For example, you want to add some quick nitrogen to your plants. Dried blood is terrific. Contains a lot of nitrogen, like 20%, and decomposes in a hurry. Or you might want to make some manure tea. Leach the nitrogen juice out of manure and pour it right alongside the plant, if indeed you have to pep up your plants. But on the other hand, if you were a good organic gardener and you put enough nitrogen in your soil in a proper form in the first place, you ought not to have to use these emergency measures, because you should have done it right at the beginning. Nitrogen is a constituent of chlorophyll, and nitrogen is a constituent of protein. Therefore, it's important. And no matter what kind of nitrogen material you put on, as fish meal, manure, urea, urine, or chemical fertilizer, they all end up, after being worked over by bacteria, as nitrate, NO3, because that's the form that plants use. And the whole secret is to keep enough nitrate present for the plant to use at a time of its greatest demand. But the catch is that if you put it in there before you plant, and the nitrate gets leached out by the rain, it won't be there when the plant needs it. So nitrogen is a easily come and easily lost thing. And it's a wise farmer that knows how to manage the nitrogen supply. Without adequate nitrogen, now the leaves will turn dead up the middle. Remember, potassium went up the outside. So you can become a good diagnostician when you look at the leaves. Without nitrogen, many leaves just simply turn pale. Lawns turn pale. You don't see a clear pattern. Although you usually see the nitrogen showing up on the older leaves, because that plant wants to reproduce. And it's going to take nitrogen from the older leaves and give it to the young ones in hopes it can make a flower, in hopes it can make a seed, in hopes it can make a new plant. And then magnesium and sulfur. This specifically now for sulfur. Many people believe that we have so much acid rain that we don't have to pay attention to sulfur in our gardens. But if you garden in a very sandy place, and this happens to be Dick Raymond of Garden Way. You've probably all heard of him. He wrote books and became quite famous. Very sandy soil in Ferrisburg, Vermont. And these were his pepper plants, if he doesn't do anything. Now remember, the acid rain is bringing down about 30 pounds of sulfur per year, and he still can't grow a good pepper on that soil. He could have probably prevented it by adding sufficient organic matter, which he didn't because he wasn't organic. Okay? So he depended upon chemical fertilizers which didn't have them. And by comparison, he put the heads of 5 old-fashioned matches under each plant. Or he used a tablespoon of Epsom salts, which is magnesium sulfate. And one way or the other, when you add sulfur to peppers, it makes a world of difference on a sandy soil, and hundreds of gardeners in Vermont have told me this. So we don't have enough sulfur for all plants in all places, even with all of the ballyhoo about acid rain bringing us too much. And as we clean up the air, the sulfur problem will become greater. And on a nationwide basis, the air is cleaner, and sulfur sales are booming in the Pacific Northwest and the Gulf Coast states. And we will be buying sulfur up here someday when the rain is cleaned up. Another nutrient that's needed in the garden is boron. My old department head did work in the 40s. He was a pioneer. This happens to be kohlrabi. Ever grown it? It's beautiful. If you have worms in your turnips and you wonder what pesticide to use, throw the turnips away and plant kohlrabi. They grow above the ground and they don't get the worms. Or if you do, they're in the root, which you don't use. You cut off anyway. Kohlrabi is like an insect-free turnip, as I see it. And the taste is about the same. You can grow purple or white. If you have trouble with internal corkiness in turnips, rutabagas, or kohlrabi, it's because there's not enough boron. And you may have growth cracks, but you also may have this yellowish tissue that you see, not a very good slide. And if you try to eat these plants, it'll be like chewing a mouthful of matchsticks. People used to call us every year and say, I can't eat my turnips, they're too tough. Well, it's boron. Where do you find boron in a natural way? Wood ashes contain 10 to 20 pounds of borax per ton, and they are an important source. Other than that, I don't know how you get it organically, specifically. There's a little bit in all compost, but maybe not enough to do the job. Chemically, you can buy commercial borax, like you use for cleaning, washing purposes, 20 mule team borax. But be very careful, because it's toxic if you use too much. Boron may also be related to this browning of the broccoli heads that they've had problems with of late. And it has to do with a lot of the other vegetables in the garden, which I won't take time to enumerate. Now, if you want all of these vegetables to grow in a healthy manner, and you want your children to grow in a healthy manner, you really need to pay attention to the things that I've been saying. For a healthy soil makes a healthy plant, which would make healthy people. I thought that picture was very symbolic of all of this kind of thing finally put together. And if you're going to do this, you will do it your way, the organic way, rather than the chemical way. And you will start out with a big pile of manure or compost in your 1,000 square foot garden, and you'll cover the garden with it, 2 inches deep. I don't know, it's a pound per square foot or 2 pounds per square foot. If it's rotted well, you won't need as much as you will if it's fresher. The older manure gets, the better it gets, because it loses water and it loses carbohydrate, and nutrient content tends to increase. It's already halfway to humus before you put it on. But it's great. And if you were to take the chemical route, you'd be doing it with chemicals and have to rake them in and maybe worry about burning and worry about not lasting. If you do the chemical route, just to give you an idea, we tell people not to use a grass fertilizer with high nitrogen, but instead to use one that has less nitrogen at the beginning. We're trying to educate chemical farmers in Vermont to put more nitrogen on after planting and less before. But on the other hand, if you're going to use organic matter, that doesn't matter very much. If you want to know how much of something to put on, it's interesting to draw a square foot in the driveway. And this could be for anything, lime or whatever. And a teaspoon per square foot equals 10 pounds per acre, or 10 pounds per 1,000 square feet, excuse me. A teaspoon per square foot equals 10 pounds per 1,000 square feet. And visually then, you can kind of get a ballpark view as to how much of something to apply.
Could you repeat that again?
1 teaspoon per square foot equals 10 pounds per 1,000 square feet. You know, people used to say, how do I tell when I put on enough? And just to say the numbers doesn't mean anything to you, but there you can see it. When you plant something, make sure you use enough rock phosphate or other phosphorus source down in the row, because it never moves. I like to grow leeks. I grow 200 or 300 feet of leeks every year. And these are the leeks being planted in the groove with the phosphorus. And if you want to put some organic matter down there too, they'll love it as well. If you can get your wife to do it, so much the better. And here's some organic matter and some rock phosphate going in a deep groove for asparagus crowns. Because that's the last time you'll ever have a chance to put phosphorus down there. Putting it on the surface for the next 20 years will not accomplish the same thing. And if you want new potatoes and new peas on the 4th of July, then you'd better put some fertility close to the potatoes, because they're known as weak feeders. Now, I'm not an organic gardener completely. I'm semi. And I do use fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, on my potatoes, because using manure will induce scab. I need some source of nutrition. I don't put mine between each seed piece, but I have 2 grooves, and I put one fertilizer to the side and plant the potatoes. But you put anything you want in there with the potatoes. Rock phosphate, seaweed, compost, anything that you want to, but put it close to the potato seed. A handful of that and a handful of potato, if you want them to grow, because they don't spread out very far. They stay confined right to the hill. And you'll have earlier potatoes. After your garden crops have come up, the chemical gardener will use side dressing. I did this once for a TV show to show people how to side dress 5-10-10. But you can use manure tea, you can use dried blood, you can use most anything that will furnish nitrogen. Ground up hair, shoe leather, ground up telephones, Bakelite, or whatever you want. Even worm casts, whatever. And this is to give a second feeding to some plants. However, if you have added enough organic matter really back at the beginning with that big pile, these supplementary feedings may be completely unnecessary in the average garden that you people plant. And chemical fertilizer people, I do suggest that they hoe in the chemicals, because the chemicals splash and come up on the plants. And you with your organic materials will not have to worry about that as a factor, although it's still a good thing to hoe around your plants for weeds and for loosening the soil. And for individually spaced plants, people would put some additional source of nitrogen around the tomatoes and around the cabbage, around all the leafy vegetables. But be careful not to put nitrogen supplies on, I don't care what kind they are. Don't put even manure tea and stuff around a tomato until blossom time. Because if you don't wait until the blossoms form, you will have a plant that goes to all leaves and stems and never bothers to set blossoms. Plants that are too vegetative will not flower. And if they don't flower, you don't make fruit. And you'll end up with a bunch of tomatoes like this on the day before frost. And have maybe only one to can or to eat. I've seen many people do this, and I've seen it in organic gardens even more prevalently than in chemical gardens. For the tendency with organic farmers is to believe that organic matter never can do any harm, and actually you can add too much nitrogen through compost and the things that you do and have nitrogen explosions and runaway nitrogen toxicity more easily even than can the people who with chemicals, because they put theirs on in the beginning, they got lost, and then they forgot to put on some more. You've been more diligent, and you have to be more careful not to over-fertilize. And so, the soil makes the garden was my topic. Not all people are born to raise tomatoes. Some of you will be good gardeners, and some of you will have green thumbs, and some of you won't. But I think that really an understanding of soil and understanding that soil is the basis of a good garden, that it really makes the garden, will help you to grow tomatoes like those. That's one of mine. I was really proud of that. Thank you. Nearly all the pictures were mine, good and bad.